My friends, let me tell you about one of the most chilling encounters I've investigated in my decades of paranormal research, the experience of Father Ralph Pecoraro at 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville. This case haunts me still, not just for its terrifying implications, but for what it reveals about the malevolent forces that can attach themselves to places of profound human suffering. To understand what Father Pecoraro faced that December day in 1975, we must first confront the horror that preceded it. Just 13 months earlier, on November 13, 1974, Ronald Feo Jr. systematically murdered his entire family with a .35 caliber rifle. His parents, Ronald Sr. and Louise, and his 4 siblings, Vaughn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew, were shot while they slept. The youngest, Mark and John Matthew, were just 12 and 9 years old. The brutality of these murders created what I call a psychic shockwave. When violence of this magnitude occurs within the confines of a home, it leaves an indelible imprint on the very fabric of that space. The walls absorb the terror, the floorboards retain the echoes of final screams, and the air itself becomes thick with the residual energy of unimaginable trauma. But here's what makes the Amityville case particularly disturbing. Ronald DeFeo Jr. himself claimed he heard voices from the house commanding him to kill. Even before the Lutz family arrived, there were whispers in the neighborhood about that house. Delivery drivers reported feeling uneasy when approaching the front door. Real estate agents spoke of cold spots and unexplained sounds during showings. The very ground beneath 112 Ocean Avenue seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. When George and Kathy Lutz purchased the house in December 1975, they knew about the murders. The drastically reduced price made that impossible to ignore. But they believed they could overcome the house's dark history with love, faith, and the blessing of their new home. How tragically wrong they were. It was December 18, 1975, when Kathy Lutz made a decision that would forever change her family's understanding of the supernatural world. As a Catholic, albeit non-practicing, she felt compelled to have their new home blessed. The recent murders weighed heavily on her mind, and she sought the protection that only sacred rituals could provide. Father Ralph Pecoraro was the priest she chose for this crucial task. This wasn't some naive country clergyman easily swayed by superstition. Father Pecoraro served multiple roles within the church. He was a psychotherapist, a lawyer, and even a judge in Catholic court. His mind was trained in both spiritual matters and rational analysis. He was a man of God, yes, but also a man of science and logic. When Kathy called Father Pecoraro and explained her request, he didn't hesitate. He understood the psychological burden that the house's history placed on the family, and he recognized the spiritual importance of consecrating a space where such evil had occurred. He agreed to perform the blessing, though he later admitted to colleagues that he felt an inexplicable dread as he prepared for the visit. The day of the blessing was unseasonably cold, with grey December clouds hanging low over Long Island. Father Pecoraro arrived at 112 Ocean Avenue in the early afternoon, carrying his small leather satchel containing holy water, blessed salt, and his worn prayer book. The Lutz family was scattered throughout the house, still unpacking boxes and trying to make this tragic space feel like home. George Lutz met Father Pecoraro at the door, and I'm told there was something in the priest's demeanor that immediately caught George's attention. Father Pecoraro seemed nervous, almost reluctant, as he crossed the threshold. Later, George would remember that the priest paused at the entrance, as if steeling himself for what lay ahead. The blessing began in the living room, where the priest sprinkled holy water and recited prayers of protection. The house felt oppressive, he later told me during our conversations. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and despite the family's attempts to brighten the space with their belongings, darkness seemed to cling to every corner. Room by room, Father Pecoraro moved through the house. The kitchen, where Louise DeFeo had prepared her family's final meal. The dining room, where they had shared their last conversation. Each space carried its own weight of sorrow and loss. But it was when he reached the staircase leading to the second floor that Father Pecoraro felt the first true warning. The temperature dropped noticeably as he climbed those stairs. Not the gradual cooling one might expect in an older house, but a sudden, dramatic plunge that made his breath visible in the air. His hands, gripping the banister, began to ache from the cold. Yet when he looked back toward the first floor, he could see sunlight streaming through the windows, and he knew the house's heating system was running. In my decades of paranormal investigation, I've learned that sudden temperature drops are among the most reliable indicators of supernatural presence. Entities, you see, require energy to manifest in our physical world. They draw this energy from their surroundings, creating these characteristic cold spots. The more dramatic the temperature change, the more powerful the entity attempting to manifest. Father Pecoraro reached the second-floor hallway and began moving from room to room. The master bedroom, where Ronald Sr. and Louise DeFeo had been murdered in their bed. Dawn's room, where the 18-year-old daughter had been shot. Allison's room, where the 13-year-old had met the same fate. Each blessing became more difficult, the priest later told me, as if something was actively resisting his prayers. But it was when he approached the final room that Father Pecoraro encountered the full fury of whatever malevolent presence had claimed dominion over the house. This had been the bedroom of Mark and John Matthew DeFeo, the two youngest victims. The boys had been sleeping in their twin beds when their brother entered with the rifle. Their deaths had been swift, but their terror in those final moments had been absolute. Kathy Lutz had planned to convert this room into a sewing space, hoping to transform a place of death into one of creation. The irony was not lost on Father Pecoraro as he stood in the doorway, holy water in hand, preparing to offer prayers for the innocent souls who had perished there. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. Father Pecoraro later described it as walking into a meat locker, the cold so intense it felt like physical assault. His breath came in sharp puffs, and the holy water in his hand began to freeze at the edges. But it wasn't just the cold that stopped him in his tracks. The room felt occupied. Not by the living, but by something that watched him with malevolent intelligence. The air itself seemed to press against him, as if the very atmosphere rejected his presence. Father Pecoraro had blessed hundreds of homes throughout his career, but never had he encountered such palpable hostility. He began his prayers anyway, his voice steady despite the growing dread in his chest. He sprinkled holy water in the sign of the cross, calling upon divine protection for the Lutz family and consecrating the space in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's when the entity made its presence known. The voice that cut through the silence was unlike anything Father Pecoraro had ever heard. It was deep, masculine, and filled with such rage that it seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. The command was simple, direct, and absolutely terrifying: get out. But this wasn't merely an auditory phenomenon. Before Father Pecoraro could even process what he had heard, before his rational mind could attempt to explain away the voice, an invisible force struck him across the face. The slap was sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably real. The priest staggered backward, his hand instinctively rising to his stinging cheek, holy water scattering across the floor. He was alone in that room. Completely alone. Yet something had physically assaulted him with enough force to leave his face burning and his mind reeling. In my years of investigation, I've encountered many forms of paranormal activity, but direct physical assault by an unseen entity is among the rarest and most disturbing manifestations. It requires tremendous energy, and indicates a level of malevolence that most earthbound spirits simply cannot achieve. Father Pecoraro stood in that freezing room for several long moments, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his faith shaken to its very core. The rational part of his mind scrambled for explanations, a branch hitting the window, a sudden temperature change causing the house to settle, anything that might account for what had just occurred. But deep in his soul, he knew the truth. Something evil had claimed this house, and it would not be driven out by simple prayers and holy water. What happened next reveals the true character of Father Pecoraro, and the depth of his faith. Despite his terror, despite the physical assault he had just endured, he did not flee. Instead, he completed his blessing of the room, his voice trembling but determined, as he recited the final prayers. Only then did he leave that cursed space, closing the door behind him with hands that shook not from cold, but from the recognition of what he had encountered. Father Pecoraro completed his blessing of the house, though he later admitted that the remaining rooms felt somehow easier, as if the entity's fury had been spent in that single, violent encounter. He gathered his belongings, spoke briefly with the Lutz family about maintaining their faith and keeping the house filled with prayer and positive energy, and left 112 Ocean Avenue believing he had done his duty. But the entity wasn't finished with him. Within hours of returning to his rectory, Father Pecoraro fell violently ill. The sickness came on suddenly and with frightening intensity, a fever that spiked to dangerous levels, racking chills that left him bedridden, and most disturbing of all, painful blisters that appeared on his hands. These weren't ordinary blisters from heat or friction. They appeared spontaneously, in patterns that some who saw them compared to stigmata, the mysterious wounds that appear on the deeply faithful as a sign of spiritual suffering. The medical community had no explanation for Father Pecораro's sudden illness. Blood tests revealed nothing. Physical examinations found no underlying cause. Yet the priest lay in his bed, burning with fever and tormented by the memory of that voice, that slap, that presence that had made clear its dominion over the house at 112 Ocean Avenue. As his strength slowly returned over the following days, Father Pecoraro felt compelled to warn the Lutz family about what he had experienced. He had said nothing to them immediately after the blessing, not wanting to frighten them unnecessarily. But his encounter with the entity, combined with his mysterious illness, convinced him that the family was in serious spiritual danger. His attempts to contact them, however, were met with frustration and mounting fear. Every phone call was interrupted by static, strange noises, or sudden disconnections. Conversations that began clearly would deteriorate into unintelligible interference. Messages left on answering machines would be mysteriously erased. It was as if the very entity that had confronted him in that bedroom was actively working to prevent him from communicating with the Lutz family. This interference with communication is, from my perspective as a parapsychologist, one of the most telling aspects of the entire case. Malevolent entities often seek to isolate their victims, cutting them off from sources of help and spiritual protection. The fact that Father Pecораro's attempts to reach the family were systematically thwarted suggests an intelligence at work, a deliberate strategy to maintain control over the situation. When Father Pecoraro finally managed to reach George Lutz by phone several days later, the conversation was brief but urgent. The priest described his experience in that upstairs bedroom, the voice, the physical assault, his subsequent illness. He warned George that the house harbored something far more dangerous than the residual trauma of the DeFeo murders. This was an active, malevolent presence that viewed the family as intruders in its domain. George Lutz later told me that Father Pecораro's warning filled him with dread, but also provided a bizarre kind of relief. The strange occurrences the family had been experiencing since moving in, the cold spots, the unexplained sounds, the pervasive sense of being watched, suddenly had context. They weren't losing their minds. They were under siege. Now, let me address the skeptics who will inevitably dismiss this account as fantasy or fabrication. Father Pecораro's experience has been scrutinized, questioned, and attacked by those who refuse to accept the possibility of genuine supernatural phenomena. Some have suggested that the priest suffered a medical episode that he misinterpreted. Others claim he was influenced by the suggestive power of the house's tragic history. But I ask you to consider this: Father Ralph Pecoraro was an educated man, trained in both theology and psychology. He had performed countless blessings throughout his career without incident. He had no history of mental illness, no pattern of making extraordinary claims. Yet on this day, in this house, he encountered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality. The physical evidence cannot be ignored. The mysterious illness that struck him immediately after the blessing. The blisters on his hands that appeared without medical explanation. The systematic interference with his attempts to warn the Lutz family. These are not the hallmarks of imagination or suggestion. They are the calling cards of a malevolent intelligence that saw the priest's blessing as a declaration of war. From my decades of investigation into the paranormal, I can tell you that Father Pecораro's experience at Amityville contains all the elements of a genuine supernatural encounter. The sudden temperature drop indicating energy manipulation by an unseen presence. The direct communication through the commanding voice. The physical assault requiring tremendous spiritual energy to accomplish. The psychic backlash that manifested as illness in the priest. The interference with communication designed to isolate the victims. But perhaps most telling of all is the entity's choice of words: "Get out." This wasn't a plea or a request. It was a territorial command from something that considered itself the rightful occupant of that house. The presence that Father Pecoraro encountered had claimed dominion over 112 Ocean Avenue, and it would not tolerate any attempt to challenge its authority. The question that haunts me, and should haunt anyone who truly understands the implications of this case, is this: what kind of malevolent intelligence possessed the power to physically assault a man of God performing sacred rituals? What fed this entity's strength? Was it the residual energy of the DeFeo murders, or something far older and more sinister that had been lying dormant beneath that house, waiting for the right moment to emerge? The Lutz family fled 112 Ocean Avenue just 28 days after moving in, leaving behind most of their possessions and never returning. They spoke of experiences far more terrifying than anything Hollywood could imagine, experiences that began with Father Pecораro's blessing and escalated until the very walls of the house seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Critics point to the fact that subsequent owners of the house reported no supernatural activity, suggesting that the entire story was fabricated. But this misses a crucial point about paranormal phenomena. Entities often form specific attachments to particular individuals or families. The presence that tormented the Lutzes and assaulted Father Pecoraro may have been drawn to their specific psychic energy, their spiritual openness, or their connection to the Catholic faith. The silence that followed the Lutz family's departure doesn't prove the story was false. It may simply mean that the entity got what it wanted: the house to itself, free from the intrusion of those who would dare to challenge its dominion with prayers and holy water. As I reflect on the case of Father Pecoraro and the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, I'm reminded of a fundamental truth about the supernatural world: there are forces in this universe that exist beyond our understanding, entities that view our physical realm as their rightful domain. When we encounter such beings, when we dare to challenge their authority with our faith and our prayers, we must be prepared for the consequences. Father Ralph Pecoraro walked into that house as a servant of God, armed with holy water and sacred words. He left as a man forever changed, marked by an encounter with evil that would haunt him for the rest of his days. His courage in the face of supernatural terror, his determination to complete his blessing despite the entity's violent warning, stands as a testament to the power of faith in the darkest of circumstances. The real horror of Amityville isn't found in the sensationalized books or Hollywood films. It's found in the quiet testimony of a man of God who faced something so malevolent, so powerful, that it could reach across the spiritual divide and strike him down with a single, contemptuous slap. That, my friends, is the true terror that lurks in the shadows of our world, not the fictional monsters of our imagination, but the very real entities that wait in the darkness, claiming dominion over the places where human suffering has torn the veil between worlds. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue still stands today, its windows dark, its secrets buried beneath layers of denial and skepticism. But those who know the truth, those who have heard Father Pecораro's testimony and understood its implications, know that some places are forever changed by the evil that has walked their halls. And sometimes, that evil is still walking there, waiting for the next family brave enough, or foolish enough, to call that cursed place home.